So we are starting, and you know, if this is the first time you're checking me out, hello, good to see you. Thanks for coming. Stick around a while. Maybe it'll even become more clear to you from a little bit now from before today and everything. And if you really think about it and you try and you look at it from a certain point of view, maybe it's gonna be good if you really look at it. And everybody together. Hi everyone, it's me. This is my new voice. Anyway, shut the fuck up, bitch. I don't know who I was saying that to. I'm just saying it general. But look, what's going on here, guys? So we got an interesting scenario on our hands. We're sort of looking at the randomization options. Now, I'm a little miffed because I was alluding to something that didn't end up happening, which is unfortunate, which is this concept that we were going to be able to get our PlayStation 3 back today, and that I was going to be able to reintegrate very quickly into the fold the missing games that we had on our list before. But suffice it to say, that is not happening. That's not going on right now. Unfortunately. But what are you gonna do? I mean, it's fine. But look, so there's an hourglass on the table. I'm sure you can see that, and it's not obscured by anything at all. And once the sand out of it goes, the amount of time that you have left to guess on which of these options it's gonna be is done. So that's kind of interesting. We're playing Pikmin. We're playing something completely different. We're playing Punch Out. That would actually, I think that option is like literally off the table right now. I don't think we can do that one for reasons I can't really get into at this exact moment. I don't wanna talk about it. It's too upsetting, and it's none of your business as well. So, Pokemon Fire Red version, Perfect Dark, Deltarune, Super Mario Galaxy, and Outlast. Now there are two other hidden options on this chart that we're not even gonna talk about. That I thought we were gonna be able to do, but unfortunately, no. So you let me know what you think it's gonna be out of those 8 options. You have a much higher chance than when it's 1 out of 8, when it's 1 out of 10. You might think based on my behavior that I'm like inebriated in some way, but I'm actually not. I'm stone cold, just raw dogging it. So that goes to show you that I communicate more effectively when I don't. That shows you that I can communicate more effectively when I do stuff. So it's time, you know, that proves that I should do it. Drink some water. So guys, what's it gonna be? What's it gonna be? I literally don't think I can do Punch Out if it comes up. So that would be very sad. Oh, well that's fun. Let's read more Blood Meridian. What do you guys have to say about that? Or it's anything else. If you pipe up right now, I'll do something else. But I think that's what we were doing before. Maybe we'll just continue on with that, yeah? Did I have that open somewhere? Wasn't it already in a window? Give me a second just to look through my files, my files, my files. No, but really, I gotta look at my files really quick here, guys. Come on, 1 second here. This does not make for a really good, effective series of like an audiobook when I'm jumping all around like this. But it's okay. This is just, I mean, it's kind of cool to see how extemporaneous I can make this. You know what I mean? I can read, if I can read extemporaneously or not. You know what I mean? So we're going to continue on with this book. It's called Blood Meridian. It's by an author named Cormac McCarthy. It's quite wonderful, and it's one of my favorite books of all time. So we're just gonna jump right in. If you haven't, listened to the other parts, go ahead and listen to those, and then we're just gonna go ahead and get started. So this is Chapter 4. Setting forth with the filibusters on alien ground, shooting antelope, pursued by cholera, wolves, wagon repairs, a desert waste, night storms, the ghost Mananda, a prayer for rain, a desert homestead, the old man, new country, an abandoned village, herdsmen on the plain, attacked by Comanches. 5 days later, on the dead man's horse, he followed the riders and wagons through the plaza and out of the town on the road down country. They rode through Castroville, where coyotes had dug up the dead and scattered their bones, and they crossed the Frio River, and they crossed the Nueces, and they left for Presidio Road and turned north with scouts posted ahead and to the rear. They crossed the Del Norte by night and waded up out of the shallow, sandy ford into a howling wilderness. Dawn saw them deployed in a long file over the plain, the dry wood wagons already moaning, horses shuffling, a dull thump of hooves and clank of gear, and the constant light chink of harness. Save for scattered clumps of buckbrush and prickly pear and little patches of twisted grass, the ground was bare, and there were low mountains to the south, and they were bare too. Westward the horizon lay flat and true as a spirit level. Those first days they saw no game, no birds save buzzards. They saw in the distance herds of sheep or goats moving along the skyline in scarves of dust, and they ate the meat of wild asses shot on the plain. The sergeant carried his saddle scabbard and a heavy Wesson rifle that used a false muzzle and paper patch, and fired a cone-shaped ball. With it he killed the little wild pigs of the desert, and later when they began to see herds of antelope, he would halt in the dusk with the sun off the land, and screwing a bipod into the threaded boss on the underside of the barrel would kill these animals where they stood grazing at distances of half a mile. The rifle carried a vernier sight on the tang, and he would eye the distance and gauge the wind and set the sight like a man using a micrometer. The second corporal would lie at his elbow with a glass and call the shots high or low should he miss, and the wagon would wait by until he had shot a stand of 3 or 4, and then rumble off across the cooling land with the skinners jostling and grinning in the bed. The sergeant never put the rifle up, but what he wiped and greased the bore. They rode well armed, each man with a rifle and many with the small-bore 5-shot Colt's revolvers. The captain carried a pair of dragoon pistols in scabbards that mounted across the pommel of the saddle so that they rode at each knee. These guns were United States issue, Colt's patent, and he had bought them from a deserter in a Soledad livery table and paid $80 in gold for them, and the scabbards and the mold and the flask they came with. The rifle the kid carried had been sawed down and rebored till it weighed very light indeed, and the mold for it was so small he had to patch the balls with buckskin. He had fired a few times, and it carried much more where it chose. It rode before him on the saddlebow, he having no scabbard. It had been carried so before, God's years of it, and forestock was much worn beneath. In the early dark the wagon came back with the meat. The skinners had piled the wagon bed with mesquite brush and stumps they drug out of the ground with the horses, and they unloaded the firewood and commenced cutting up the gutted antelopes, in the floor of the wagon with bowie knives and hand axes, laughing and hacking in a welter of gore, a reeking scene in the light of the handheld lanterns. By full dark, the blackened rib racks leaned steaming at the fires, and there was a jousting over the coals with shaven sticks, whereon were skewered gobs of meat and clank of canteens and endless raillery. And sleep that night on cold plains of a foreign land, 46 men wrapped in their blankets under the self-same stars, the prairie wolves so like in their yammering, yet all about so changed and strange. They caught up and set out each day in the dark before the day yet was, and they ate cold meat and brisket and made no fire. The sun rose on a column already ragged these 6 days out. Among their clothes there was small agreement, and among their hats less. The little painted horses stepped shifty and truculent, and vicious snarl of flies fought constantly in the bed of the game wagon. The dust the party raised was quickly dispersed and lost in the immensity of that landscape, and there was no dust other for pale sutler, who pursued them drives unseen, and his lean horse and his lean cart leave no track upon such ground or any ground. By 1,000 fires in the iron blue dusk he keeps his commissary, and he's a wry and grinning tradesman, good to follow every campaign or hound men from their holes in just those whited regions where they've gone to hide from God. On this day 2 men fell sick, and 1 died before dark. In the morning there was another ill to take his place. The 2 of them were made among sacks of beans and rice and coffee in the supply wagon, with blankets over them to keep them from the sun. And they rode with the slamming and jarring of the wagon, half shearing in the meat from their bones, so that they cried out to the left, and then they died. The men turned out in the early morning darkness to dig their graves with the blade bones of antelope, and they covered them with stones and rode on again. They rode on, and the sun in the east flushed pale streaks of light, and then a deeper run of color like blood seeping up in sudden reaches, flaring plain-wise, and where the earth drained up into the sky at the edge of creation, the top of the sun rose out of nothing like the head of a great red phallus, until it cleared the unseen rim and sat squat and pulsing and malevolent behind them. The shadows of the smallest stones lay like pencil lines across the sand, and the shapes of the men and their mounts advanced elongate before them like strands of the night from which they had ridden, like tentacles to bind them to the darkness yet to come. They rode with their heads down, faceless under their hats, like an army asleep on the march. By mid-morning another man had died, and they lifted him from the wagon where he'd stained the stacks he'd lain among, the buried him also, and rode on. Now wolves had come to follow them, great pale lobos with yellow eyes, that trotted neat of foot or squatted in the shimmering heat to watch them from where they made their noon halt. Moving on again, loping, sidling, ambling with their long noses to the ground. In the evening their eyes shifted and winked out there on the edge of the firelight, and in the morning when the riders rode out on the cool dark they could hear the snarling and the pop of their mouths behind them as they sacked the camp for meat scraps. The wagons drew so dry they slouched from side to side like dogs, and the sand was grinding them away. The wheels shrank and the spokes reeled in their hubs and clattered like loom shafts, and at night they drive false spokes into the mortises and tie them down with strips of green hide, and they drive wedges between the iron of the tires and the sun-cracked felloes. They wobbled on, the trace of their untrue labors like sidewinder tracks in the sand. The deluge pegs worked loose and dropped behind. Wheels began to break up. 10 days out with 4 men dead, they started across a plain of pure pumice where there grew no shrub, no weed as far as the eye could see. The captain called a halt, and he called up the Mexican who served as a guide.
They talked, and the Mexican gestured, and the captain gestured, and after a while they moved on again. "This looks like the high road to hell to me," said a man from the ranks. "What does he reckon for the horses to eat?" "I believe they're supposed to just grit up on this sand like chickens and be ready for the shell corn when it does come." In 2 days they began to come up upon bones and cast off apparel. They saw half-buried skeletons of mules, with the bones so white and polished they seemed incandescent even in that blazing heat, and they saw panniers and pack saddles and the bones of men, and saw a mule entire, the dried and blackened carcass hard as iron. They rode on. The white noon saw them through the waste like a ghost army, so pale they were with dust, like shades of figures erased upon a board. The wolves loped paler yet, and grouped and skittered, and lifted their lean snouts on the air. At night the horses were fed by hand from sacks of meal, and watered from buckets. There was no more sickness. The survivors lay quietly in that cratered void and watched the white-hot stars go rifling down the dark, or slept with their alien hearts beating in the sand like pilgrims exhausted upon the face of the planet Antaria and Anarita, clutched to a namelessness wheeling in the night. They moved on, and the iron of the wagon tires grew polished bright as chrome in the pumice. To the south, the blue cordilleras stood footed in their paler image on the sand like reflections in a lake, and there were no wolves now. They took to riding by night, silent jornadas save for the trundling of the wagons and the wheeze of the animal. Under the moonlight, a strange party of elders with the white dust thick on their mustaches and their eyebrows. They moved on, and the stars jostled and arced across the firmament and died beyond the ink-black mountains. They came to know the night skies well, western eyes that read more geometric constructions round, while Orion rose in the south than those names given by the ancients. Tethered to the pole star, they rode the Dipper round, while Orion rose in the southwest like a great electric kite. The sand lay blue in the moonlight, and the iron tires of the wagons rolled among the shapes of the riders in gleaming hoops that veered and wheeled woundlessly and vaguely navigational like slender astro blades, and the polished shoes of the horses kept hasping up like a myriad of eyes winking across the desert floor. They watched storms out there so distant they could not be heard, the silent lightning flaring sheetwise, and the thin black spine of the mountain chain fluttering and sucked away again in the dark. They saw wild horses racing on the plain, pounding their shadows down the night and leaving in the moonlight a vaporous dust like the palest strain of their passing. All night the wind blew, and the fine dust set their teeth on edge, sand and everything, grit in all they ate. In the morning, a urine-colored sun rose blearily through panes of dust on a dim world and without feature. The animals were failing. They halted and made a dry camp without wood or water, and the wretched ponies huddled and whimpered like dogs. That night, they rode through a region electric and wild, where strange shapes of soft blue fire ran over the metal of the horses' trappings, and the wagon wheels rolled in hoops of fire, and little shapes of pale blue light came to perch in the ears of the horses and in the beards of the men. All night sheet lightning quaked sourceless to the west beyond the midnight thunderheads, making a blush day of the distant desert. The mountains on the sudden skyline, stark and black and livid like a land of some other order out there whose true geology was not stone but fear. The thunder moved up from the southwest, and lightning lit the desert all about them. Blue and barren, great clanging reaches ordered out from the absolute night like some demon kingdom summoned up, or changeling land that come the day would leave them neither trace nor smoke nor ruin more than any troubling dream. They halted in the dark, to recruit the animals, and some of the men stowed their arms in the wagons for fear of drawing the lightning, and a man named Hayward prayed for rain. He prayed, "Almighty God, if it ain't too far out of the way of things in your eternal plan, do you reckon we could have a little rain down here?" "Pray it up," some called, and kneeling he cried out among the thunder and the wind, "Lord, we are dried to jerky down here. Just a few drops from some old boys out here on the prairie and a long ways from home." "Amen," they said, and catching up their mounts, they rode on. Within the hour, the wind cooled and drops of rain the size of grape shot fell upon them out of that wild darkness. They could smell wet stone and the sweet smell of wet horses and wet leather. They rode on. They rode through the heat of the day, following with the water kegs empty and the horses perishing in the evening. These elect, shabby and white with dust, like a company of armed mounted millers wandering in dementia, rode up off the desert through a gap in the low stone hills and down upon a solitary jackal, crude hut of mud and wattles and rudimentary stable and corrals. Bone palings ruled the small and dusty purlieu here, and death seemed the most prevalent feature of the landscape. Strange fences that the sand and wind had scoured and the sun bleached and cracked like old porcelain with dry brown weather cracks, and where no life moved. The corrugated forms of the riders passed jingling across the sky, bister land, and across the mud facade of the jackal, the horses trembling, smelling water. The captain raised his hand and the sergeant spoke, and two men dismounted and advanced upon the hut with rifles. They pushed open a door made of rawhide and entered. In a few minutes, they reappeared. "Somebody's here somewheres. There's hot coals." The captain surveyed the distance with an air of vigilance. He dismounted with the patience of one used to dealing with incompetence and crossed to the jackal. When he came out, he surveyed the terrain again. The horses shifted and clinked and stamped, and the men pulled their jaws down and spoke roughly to them. "Sergeant?" "Yes?" "These people can't be far. See if you can find them. And see if there's any forage here for the animals." "Forage?" "Forage." The sergeant placed a hand on the cantle and looked about at the place they were in and shook his head and dismounted. They went through the jackal and into the enclosure behind and out to the stable. There were no animals and nothing but a small half filled with dry sotoles in the way of feed. They walked out the back to a sink among the stones where water stood and a thin stream flowed away over the sand. There were hoof prints about the tank and dry manure, and some small birds ran mindlessly along the rim of the little creek. The sergeant had been squatting on his heels, and now he rose and spat. "Well," he said, "is there any direction you can't see 20 mile in?" The recruits studied the emptiness about. I don't believe the folks here has gone that long." They drank and walked back towards the jackal. Horses were being led along the narrow path. The captain was standing with his thumbs in his belt. "I can't see where they've got to," said the sergeant. "What's in the shed?" "Some old dry fodder," the captain found. "They ought to have a goat or a hog, something. Chickens?" In a few minutes, two men came dragging out an old man from the stable. He was covered with dust and dry chaff, and he held one arm across his eyes. He was dragged moaning to the captain's feet, where he lay prostrate in what looked like windings of white cotton. He put his hands over his ears and his elbows before his eyes like one called upon to witness some appalling thing. The captain turned away in disgust. The sergeant towed him with his boot. "What's wrong with him?" he said. "He's pissing himself, Sergeant." "He's pissing himself." The captain gestured at the man with his gloves. "Yes, sir." "Well, get him the hell out of here." "You want Candelario to talk to him?" "He's a half-wit. Get him away from me." They dragged the old man away. He had begun to babble, but no one listened, and in the morning he was gone. They bivouacked by the tank, and the farrier saw to the mules and the ponies and had thrown shoes, and they worked on the wagons by firelight far into the night. They set forth a crimson dawn where sky and earth close in a razorous plain. Out there dark little archipelagos of cloud, and the vast world of sand and scrub shearing upward into the shoreless void where the blue islands trembled and the earth grew uncertain, gravely canted and veering out through the tinctures of rose and dark beyond the dawn to the uttermost rebate of space. They rode through regions of party-colored stone, upthirst, and ragged kerfs, and shelves of trap rock, reared in faults and anticlines, curved back upon themselves and broken off like stumps of great stone tree boles and stones the lightning had clove open, seeps exploding in stem of some old storm. They rode past trap dikes of brown rock running down the narrow chines in the ridges and onto the plain like the ruins of old walls. Such auguries everywhere in the hand of man before man was or any living thing. They passed through a village then and now in ruins, and they camped in the walls of a tall mud church and burned the fallen timbers of the roof for their fire while owls cried from the arches in the dark. The following day, the skyline to the south, they saw clouds of dust that lay across the earth for miles. They rode on, watching the dust until it began to near, and the captain raised his hand for a halt and took from his saddlebag his old brass cavalry telescope and uncoupled it and swept it slowly over the land. The sergeant sat his horse beside him, and after a while the captain handed him the glass. Hell of a herd of something. I believe it's horses. How far off do you make 'em? Hard to tell. Call Candelario up here. The sergeant turned and motioned for the Mexican. When he rode up, he handed him a glass, and the Mexican raised it to his eye and squinted. Then he lowered the glass and watched with his naked eyes, and then he raised it and looked again. Then he sat his horse with the glass at his chest like a crucifix. Well, said the captain. He shook his head. What the hell does that mean? They're not buffalo, are they? No, I think maybe horses. Let me have the glass. The Mexican handed him the telescope and he glassed the horizon again and collapsed the tube shut with the heel of his hand and replaced it in his bag and raised his hand, and they went on. They were cattle, mules, horses. There were several thousand head, and they were moving quarterwise toward the company. By late afternoon, riders were visible to the bare eye, a handful of ragged Indians mending the outer flanks of the herd with their nimble ponies, others in hats, perhaps Mexicans. The sergeant dropped back to where the captain was riding. What do you make of that, Captain? I make it a parcel of heathen stock thieves is what I make it. What do you? Well, looks like it to me. The captain watched through the glass. I suppose they've seen us, he said. They've seen us. How many riders do you make it? A couple dozen, maybe. The captain tapped the instrument in his hand. They don't seem concerned, do they? No, sir, they don't. The captain smiled grimly. We may see a little sport here before the day is out. The first of the herd began to swing past them in a pall of yellow dust. Rangy, ladder-tribbed cattle with horns that grew agoggle, and no two alike, and small, thin mules, coal-black, that shouldered one another and reared their mallet-shaped heads above the backs of the others, and then more cattle, and finally the first of the herders riding up the outer side and keeping the stock between themselves and the mounted company. Behind them came a herd of several hundred ponies. The sergeant looked for Candelario. He kept backing along the ranks, but he could not find him. He nudged his horse through the column and moved up the far side. The lattermost of the drovers were now coming through the dust, and the captain was gesturing and shouting. The ponies began to veer off from the herd, and the droves were beating their way toward this armed company met with on the plain. Already you could see through the dust in the ponies' hides and painted chevrons in the hands and rising suns and birds and fish of every device like the shade of old work through sizing on a canvas. And now too you could hear above the pounding of the unshod hooves and the piping of Kenya flutes neaned from human bones, and some among the company had begun to saw back on their mounts, and some to mill in confusion, when up from the offside of those ponies there rose a fabled horse of mounted lancers and archers bearing shields bedight with bits of broken mirror glass that cast 1,000 unpieced suns against the eyes of the enemies. A legion of horribles, hundreds in numbers, half naked or clad in costumes, Attic or biblical or wardrobed out of a fever dream, with the skins of animals and silk finery and pieces of uniform still tracked with the blood of prior owners, coats of slain dragoons, frogged and braided cavalry jackets, one in a stovepipe hat, and one with an umbrella, and one in white stockings and a blood-stained wedding veil, and some in headgear of crane feathers or rawhide helmets that bore the horns of bull or buffalo, and one in a pigeon-tail coat worn backwards and otherwise naked, and one in the armor of a Spanish conquistador, the breastplate and the pauldrons deeply dented with old bows of mace or saber done in another country by men whose very bones were dust, and many with their braids spliced up with the hair of other beasts until they trailed upon the ground, and their horses' ears and tails worked with bits of brightly colored cloth, and one whose horse's whole head was painted crimson red, and all the horsemen's faces gaudy and grotesque, with daubings like a company of mounted clowns. Death, hilarious, all howling in a barbarous tongue and riding down upon them like a horde from a hell more horrible yet than the brimstone land of Christian reckoning, screeching and yammering and clothed in smoke like those vaporous beings in regions beyond right knowing, where the eye wanders and the lips jerks and drools. "Oh my God," said the sergeant. A rattling drove of arrows passed through the company, and men tottered and dropped from their mounts. Horses were rearing and plunging, and the Mongol horde swung up along their flanks and turned and rode full upon them with the lances. The company was now come to a halt, and the first shots were fired, and the gray rifle smoke rolled through the dust as the lancers breached their ranks. The kid's horse sank beneath him, and with a long pneumatic sigh. He had already fired his rifle, and now he sat on the ground and fumbled with his shot pouch. A man near him sat with an arrow hanging out of his neck. He was bent slightly, as if in prayer. The kid would have reached for the bloody hoop iron point, but then he saw that the man wore another arrow in his breast to the fletchling, and he was dead. There were horses down and men scrambling, and he saw a man who sat charging his rifle while blood ran from his ears, and he saw men with their revolvers disassembled trying to fit the spare-loaded cylinders they carried, and he saw men kneeling who tilted and clasped their shadows on the ground, and he saw men lanced and caught up by the hair and scalped standing, and he saw the horses of war trample down the fallen, and a little white-faced pony with one clouded eye leaned out of the murk and snapped at him like a dog and was gone. Among the wounded, some seemed dumb and without understanding, and some were pale through the masks of dust, and some had fouled themselves or tottered brokenly onto the spears of the savages. Now driving in a wild frise of headlong horses with eyes walled and teeth cropped, and naked riders with clusters of arrows clenched in their jaws and their shields winking in the dust, and up and the far side of the ruined ranks and a piping of bone flutes, and dropping down off the sides of their mounts with one heel hung in the wither strap, and their short bows flexing beneath the outstretched necks of the ponies until they had circled the company and cut their ranks in two, and then rising up again like funhouse figures. Some with nightmare faces painted on their breasts, riding down the unhorsed Saxons and spearing and clubbing them, and leaping from their mounts with knives and running about on the ground with a peculiar bandy-legged trot like creatures driven to alien forms of locomotion, and stripping the clothes from the dead and seizing them up by the hair and passing their blades about the skulls of the living and the dead alike, and snatching aloft the bloody wigs, and hacking and chopping at the naked bodies, ripping off limbs, heads, gutting the savage white strange torsos, and holding up great handfuls of viscera genitals, some of the savages so slathered up with gore they might have rolled in it like dogs, and some who fell upon the dying and sodomized them with loud cries to their fellows. And now the horses of the dead came pounding out of the smoke and dust, encircled with flapping leather, and wild manes and eyes widened with fear like the eyes of the blind, and some were feathered with arrows, and some lanced through, and stumbling and vomiting blood as they wheeled across the killing ground and clattered from side again. Dust stanched the wet and naked heads of the scalped, who, with the fringe of hair below their wounds and tonsured to the bone, now lay like maimed and naked monks in the blood-slacked dust, and everywhere the dying groaned and gibbered, and horses lay screaming. Ooh, now that's spooky.